Tonight's Planning and Development Committee meeting, this being Monday the 9th of April. We'll start by confirming the information about the webcast, which is on here. In the spirit of open and accessible and transparent government, Albury City Council and committee meetings are video recorded and webcast. By speaking at the council or committee meeting, members of the public agree to being recorded and webcast. Albury City accepts no liability for any defamatory, discriminatory or offensive remarks or gestures that may be made during the course of the council or committee meeting. Opinions expressed or statements made by individuals are the opinions or statements of those individuals and do not imply in any form endorsement by Albury City. Okay, ready for the conflict of interest declarations. I'm not aware of any. None received by the General Manager. We'll move on to disclosures. There aren't any. Mr. General Manager.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This advice to the committee relates to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. 1979, Section 147 requires a person submitting planning applications or submissions regarding a planning application to disclose any reportable political donations and or gifts to any local councillor or employee of council. Reportable political donations include those of or above $1,000. The disclosure statement forms are available on Council's website or from the Customer Service Centre and must be lodged in accordance with the Act. The forms are also available at the back of the chamber during meetings. In dealing with development applications, councillors need to take into account specific matters contained in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. Accordingly, the provisions of Section 79C1 of that Act are set out in the Council Officer's report detailing issues to be considered. The Local Government Act 1993, Section 375A, requires that a division be called whenever a motion for a planning decision is put at a meeting of the council or a council committee. Planning decision means a decision made in the exercise of a function of council under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, including a decision relating to a development application, an environmental planning instrument, a development control plan or a development contributions plan, but not including the making of an order under Division 2A of Part 6 of that Act. Matters appearing in the Planning and Development Committee meeting minutes which require a planning decision to be made will be dealt with separately and immediately following the motion for the adoption of the Planning and Development Committee meeting minutes. In respect to these matters, motions for a planning decision put before Council will be considered a division and recorded in accordance with Section 375A of the Local Government Act 1993. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And we'll move on to apologies. There are no apologies from councillors this evening, I believe.
That's correct.
And we'll move to the confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting, that previous meeting being the 12th of February 2018. Councillor Doxey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the recommendation that the minutes of the Planning and Development Committee meeting held on Monday, 12 February 2018 at 6 p.m. be confirmed.
Thank you. Councillor Mack.
Happy to second that, Madam Chair.
Thank you. There's no indication of any questions about those minutes, so I'll put those minutes to the committee. All those in favour? Anyone against? That motion is carried. Next item is minutes arising from the minutes. Are there any questions pertaining to those minutes? There being no indication of any, we'll move to the reports and minutes of committees and working parties. We've got the Companion Animals Advisory Panel meeting held the 21st of February 2018. Councillor Mack.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wish to recommend that Council recommends to Council. Committee recommends to Council the minutes recommendation of the Companion Animals Advisory Panel meeting held on Wednesday, the 21st February 2018 be received, noted and accepted. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Mack, are you happy if we put those minutes? There's no indication of any questions.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'll put those minutes to the committee. All those in favour? Anyone against? That motion is carried. The next item is Planning and Development Committee Sustainability Advisory Committee minutes, and we have a report attached to that on page 13. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the committee recommends to Council that Council receive, note and accept the minutes of the Sustainability Advisory Committee meeting held on Tuesday, 27th of February.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, are you happy to put those minutes? Would you like to speak? Sorry? Fine, okay. And there's no indication of any questions either. So I'll put those minutes to the committee. All those in favour? Anyone against? That motion is carried. Moving on now to officers' reports for consideration. Development application 10.2017.35200.1 alterations and additions to adult entertainment venue 727 Drome Street, East Albury. Councillor Van der Ven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to move that the committee recommends to Council A receive and note this report, and B, grant consent for development application 10.2017.35200.1 subject to the conditions contained in the draft determination attachment 4.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, even though I've never been there, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Doxey. Councillor Van der Ven, just for your information, there are no questions or anyone wishing to speak against. However, would you like to speak to that?
Madam Chair, just briefly, it is a lengthy report and covers a lot of issues. But from my perspective, there's not a lot we can do. I've had no feedback from the community. Obviously, a little bit different to the last time the development application came up for this initial development. But the development's there. It's being sought to modify slightly. It's all within the rules and regs as Council has determined, and therefore there's not much more that we can do or say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Van der Ven. We do have a question from Councillor Suchbury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the relevant member of staff or author of the document. I was just wondering why throughout the document, wherever the phrase working rooms was typed up, it was in quotation marks.
Thank you, Mr. Zakovich. Mr. Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, it's a direct reference to the information provided by the applicant. It's a quotation from their description.
Thank you, Mr. Keys. Councillor Suchbury.
Thank you, Mr. Keys. That's interesting.
There being no indication of any further questions or indeed anyone wishing to speak against, Councillor Van der Ven, would you like to close debate?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'll put that recommendation to Council, noting that it is a planning decision and therefore we will need to record the votes. All those in favour of the recommendation? Thank you. Councillors Suchbury, Doxey, Glacken, Con, Thurley and Van der Ven. Councillors against? Councillors King and Mack. I won't make a comment. That motion is carried. Thank you. We're now moving, councillors, to the draft cat management policy and procedure, which is on page 43 of our electronic documents. Councillor Van der Ven.
Madam Chair, I indeed do have much pleasure in recommending that the committee recommends to Council that Council endorses the draft policy and procedure for public exhibition.
Thank you, Councillor Van der Ven. Councillor Mack wishing to second.
Yes, begrudgingly, Madam Chair, I'm happy to second that recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley has a question. Councillor Van der Ven, did you wish to over debate or we'll move to the question? Thank you. Councillor Thurley, your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, to the relevant member of staff. I note a couple of issues, and so my question firstly is about the Companion Animals Act. What ability does Council have to try and influence this Act? Because it seems to me that it leaves Council almost powerless with regard to the regulation of cats in our community. That's my first question. The second one relates to cat traps. And I notice our policy gives reasons where we will and reasons where we don't. But if a resident continually ignores complaints from a neighbour and ignores the advice given by council rangers, why would we not then allow a cat trap to be placed for that cat?
Mr Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, in regards to the first one, the companion animals regulations and policies and legislation was reviewed approximately, I think the review was about 2 years ago. There was a fairly extensive submissions and debate around the issues in relation to cats, and we've been left with what we've got at the moment. There hasn't been a strong support across the board for improving those controls. A lot of interest groups that made representation in regards to that on both sides, literally, of a fence, for and against. So at this stage, we'd have to wait for a further review of the companion animals supporting legislation. We're certainly happy to take that up and make further representation. In regards to the second one, again, it's the provisions and protection that's provided to owners of cats under the legislation. And where a cat owner is known and identified, then the first interest is trying to get them to take responsibility for the ownership and the management of their cat rather than issuing traps, in which case where the animal is already known who the owner is, it would simply be returned to that owner again. We can go through the public notification process or exhibition process, take into account any representations that are made and potentially give this further consideration if councils wish to do so.
Thank you, Mr Keys. We have some more questions now. Councillor Thurley, is yours a follow-up question? Okay, so we'll go to Councillor Thurley with a follow-up question, and then we've got a couple of other questions as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Thurley.
I note that Mr Keys' comment that the cat would simply be returned to the owner. Is there any financial penalty for the cat continually being on the loose? And if it were caught in a trap, is it simply returned at no cost, or is there a fine under council bylaw?
Mr Keys. Mr Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, at this point in time, the provisions of the companion animals management or companion animals legislation doesn't allow for a fine. We encourage all cat owners to register their animals so we can return them to them as safely and as quickly as possible and provide additional education and advice to them. That's the best program we've got. This policy itself will help us to provide greater coverage, to provide greater community appreciation, and hopefully in time we can change some of those behaviours where people do not take responsibility or are unaware of their responsibility and also the expectations of the surrounding community and neighbourhood.
Thank you, Mr Keys. Now we have questions from Councillor Van der Ven and then Councillor Mack. Councillor Van der Ven.
Just as a follow-up on two questions from Councillor Thurley and the responses, how many times do we trap the cat and give it back to the owners before we do something?
Mr Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, we do keep a record of where our cat traps go out. Typically, we do find that people where their cat has been caught change their behaviour, take steps and precautions to try and stop it happening again. Where we do have some people who simply refuse to take that responsibility. But where the owner of a cat is known, we don't tend to go and issue the cat traps in every instance. So it is about education, trying to encourage them to change their behaviours, be aware and become more aware of their responsibilities, both to themselves, their neighbours and the cat itself.
Thank you, Mr Keys. Councillor Van der Ven, you had a follow-up? Yep.
My understanding is that all cats are required to be registered and microchipped. Is that correct, my understanding?
Mr Keys.
Cats, I think it's over 6 months of age, are required to be registered and microchipped.
Councillor Van der Ven, you look like you have a follow-up question.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. On the basis of the answer provided to a previous question, I I heard the response say that if we know the owner of the cat, well, I would have thought that under all circumstances, apart from young kittens or 6 months, I don't know whether you call a 6-month-old cat a kitten still, but that you would know who the owner is. And if they transgress or take no notice and their cat gets caught 4 or 5 times, surely we have some mechanism whereby we can take the cat out of circulation.
Mr. Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, no, that's not correct at all. There are protections for animals and the owners of animals to try and ensure the animals return to them as soon as possible. Unfortunately, not all cat owners do register or microchip their cats, and that they're typically ones that we may catch, take to the pound, and go through the appropriate process in those circumstances. Where a cat is registered, typically where we get a complaint, our first question is, do you know who the owner of the animal is? Have you spoken to the owner? Are you able to take up and express your concern and talk to them about it? Following that, if we have further issues and complaints, we will send our rangers out and they will speak to the neighbours and try and provide them with further advice and information about how to control and the benefits of managing their animal. Post that, where we do have an instance in a neighbourhood where the owner of the cat or even the cat itself may not be clearly identified what property it's coming from, maybe where we use cat traps if there's an ongoing nuisance. And we have had occasion to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Keys.
I have a further follow-up.
Yes.
If it's possible.
Just on Councillor Mack, you've taken your light off. Yep, Councillor Vandermeer.
So on the basis, again, of some of the answers and questions through you, Madam Chair, so if a cat that hasn't been microchipped and is taken to the pound and the owners come along and claim it, what happens under those circumstances? Are they fined for not having a unregistered cat, or are they just given an opportunity to register the cat, microchip it and walk away?
Mr. Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, typically they're required to register or microchip the animal, and typically it'll be dependent on what the age of the cat is. If it's more than 6 months, that's usually required and evidence of. That's going to be done or has been done. Otherwise, if it's less than 6 months old, the requirement is not until the kitten has passed the 6-month age.
So I only got part answer there,
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Councillor Vandermeer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So is there a fine if a cat finishes up at the pound and the owners come to claim it and the cat is over 6 months old? Is there a fine for having a cat that is unregistered?
Mr. Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'd have to take that on notice if I can,
Thank you.
just to clarify.
Yep, that will be fine. We note that will be taken on notice and clarification will be given to councillors. Thank you. Councillor Mack, you have a question now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a bit like a royal commission into cats. Just a question in relation to the educational component. I know that we have several subdivisions in the Thaguna precinct that are considered cat protected zones. To what level are we engaging residents or potential residents in those areas in relation to education and knowledge of this particular policy? I understand we're sticking our paws in the water with this one to start with, but if we can encourage pet ownership in terms of those estates, it can sort of proliferate. Is there any response to that? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. We'll go to Mr. Keys for that. And it's not cat protection zones, they are cat prohibition zones. Mr. Keys.
Through you, Madam Chair, there's certainly the main driver and the reason for us trying to get this policy out and into the community for consultation and exhibition is to make sure we can have that in play and support as these new estates come online. The first residents of either of the estates that are concerned will not be become residents for probably another 6 to 12 months as a minimum. We want to have this policy and procedure in place before they move in there. We've been in discussion with the developers of those estates, and we'll be looking to try and provide the material and have education directly through the developers to the future owners as part of whether it's house and land packages or even just as part of the sale information on those estates. but certainly we need to get this in place so that we can then begin and commence those before we get too many residents out there taking up those offers.
Thank you, Mr. Keys. There's no indication of any further questions. This was moved by Councillor Van der Ven and seconded by Councillor Mack. It's the draft cat management policy. I'll ask Councillor Van der Ven if he would like to close debate. Councillor Van der Ven.
Well, seeing we haven't opened debate yet, Madam Chair, it's...
Would you like to open debate?
Well, I don't think we need to, but just for procedural sake, the issue here is pretty clear. We do need to show some leadership as far as trying to mitigate the damage the cats do in our community if left to roam. We've already started down that track with the new developments out at Thaguna, having the cat strategies like curfews, etc., as a condition of development consent. So I look forward to having an opportunity to workshop the potential submissions to any revisions of the Companion Animals Act concerning cats, because anecdotally they do a lot of damage to fauna, as well as the unsociable aspects of their behaviour also needs to be able to be mitigated for neighbours of cat owners. So I'm not sure what you want me to do, Madam Chair. If somebody wants to speak against it, I'll take this as an opening. If they don't, take it as a close. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Van der Ven. There's no indication of anyone wishing to speak against, so if you're happy to leave it, that is. I'll now put that recommendation to council, to the committee. All those in favour? Anyone against? That motion is carried. Next paper we're dealing with, officers' reports for noting the Smart Community Framework on page 48 of our electronic documents. Councillor Van der Ven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll move the recommendation that the committee recommends to council receive and note the Smart Community Framework report.
Thank you, Councillor Van der Ven. Councillor Con.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to second that.
Thank you. Councillor Van der Ven, just to confirm, there's no one wishing to speak against and there's no indication of any questions?
No, I think that this is a great report. There's some really exciting things happening in that smart community space, and I welcome anything that this council can do around that. The issue of the smart communities framework. So I look forward to whatever comes next in our processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Van der Ven. I'll take that as opening and closing debate. There's still no further indication of any questions, etc. So I'll put that motion to the committee. All those in favour? Anyone against? That motion is carried. The next paper we're dealing with is the Planning and Development Committee report, the monthly statistics, March 2018. And that's on page 54 of our document. Councillor Suchbury.
Madam Chair, I move that the committee recommends to council that the information that is in this report be received and noted.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Suchbury, would you like to speak to this? There's no one indicating they wish to speak against it and there's no questions at this stage.
No, I don't think it needs anything.
Thank you. I do have a question from Mr. Keys. Mr. Keys.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councillors, if I could just add one comment. I did note in the report about the timing of this report, and you'll notice the date is back on the 27th of March when it was prepared that this information relates to. Since then, we've had other applications that have been identified which meet the criteria under the new resolution of council for bringing it to your attention. A number of those applications are minor and of small significance, but meet the criteria for council's notification. We were planning on sending an email list of those around to you tomorrow, but essentially we've got them in the pipeline ready to be approved this week. And rather than wait another month and hold those up, if I could send an email around to you tomorrow with a list highlighting what the areas of significance are and ask for your consideration as to whether you want further information or would like those brought to council for decision before the end of the week, that would certainly be appreciated.
Thank you. There's no indication from any councillors here wishing to question or make comment on that. So thank you, Mr. Keys. So we've moved and seconded and we've dealt with that one. We haven't voted. Okay. We will now put that recommendation to the committee. All those in favour? Anyone against? That motion is carried. And we're now dealing with delegates' reports for noting there's none. Notices of urgent business, I'm not aware of any. No lights are coming up. And confidential matters, there are none as well. So I now close the meeting at 6:26 p.m. Thank you very much. I found the right blurb now. It was missing before.
I don't know why we can't do that once for the two committee meetings, but anyway.
Won't be a problem for much longer.
No.
Thanks goodness. We won't have to play musical chairs.
Thank you. I'll declare open the Engineering and Works Committee meeting today, 9th of April. Committee meetings. This committee meeting is being webcast and recorded. By speaking at the committee meeting, you agree to being recorded and webcast. Please ensure that if and when you are speaking at this committee meeting, you are respectful to other people and use appropriate language. AlburyCity accepts no liability for any defamatory or offensive remarks or gestures made during the course of this committee meeting. An audio recording will be made for administrative purposes. Any conflict of interest declarations received? None received. No apologies as far as I'm aware of. And we'll go to EWC 4, confirmation of minutes of the previous meeting. Don't be shy. Thank you, Councillor Stutchbury.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the minutes, I can't see it, there we go. I move that the committee recommends to council that the minutes of the Engineering and Works Committee meeting held on Monday, 12th March 2018 at 6 p.m. be confirmed.
Thank you, Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to second that.
Thank you. I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. Any matters arising from those minutes? If there are none, I'll move to reports and minutes of committees and working parties. EWC 6.1, minutes of the Albury Airport Users Advisory. Councillor Glacken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to move the recommendation that the minutes and recommendations of the Albury Airport Advisory Committee held on Monday the 7th of March 2018 be received, noted and accepted. And note that you chaired the first 10 or 12 minutes of that meeting for me.
Fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley.
Second the motion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do you wish to speak to that, Councillor Glacken?
No, thank you.
I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Against? It's carried. Officers' reports for consideration. EWC 7.1, fabrication installation of 2 pedestrian bridges. Councillor Glacken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to move the recommendation that the committee recommends to council that council accepts the tender from JC Butco Engineering Proprietary Limited for contract number 17/02135, supply and installation of 2 pedestrian bridges, Tabletop Road, in the lump sum of $287,874.78, including GST, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley.
Second the motion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Glacken, do you wish to speak to that motion? Or the recommendation?
Very briefly, Mr. Chair, it's important that we do facilitate and enable the continuing pedestrian access in our growing areas, and we're all very aware of areas within the Thurgoona precinct that under the in the era of the Development Corporation, weren't given footpaths. Council has spent some considerable time working on ensuring that is being remedied, and so it's good that we are showing taking a lead and ensuring that pedestrian access is being enabled throughout the continuing development of our areas of the city. So I encourage all councillors to support this recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just have a quick question. The two bridges that were done out on the Riverina Highway, do we have any pictures of what's proposed for these two, and are they looking very similar to the ones that were done? Thank you. Mr. Ferris?
You, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly they're the same design as the ones on Riverina Highway.
Okay, thank you. No, that looks they look great, so we look forward to them being done and completed. If there's no further questions or comments, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. Item EWC 7.2, supply of landfill alternate daily covering system contract number. Councillor David Thurley.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, Councillor David Thurley.
I would like to move that the committee recommends to council that council accepts the tender from Superior Environmental Services Proprietary Limited for contract numbers 17/01843, supply of landfill alternate covering system in the lump sum amount of $237,066, including GST.
Thank you. Councillor Mack.
Happy to second that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, do you wish to open debate?
Really briefly, I mean, this seems to be another positive step in our landfill management in that we are looking at a way to quickly cover the waste and reduce the possibility of odour generation on the site. I was interested in the very expensive alternative, which may have been perhaps slightly more environmentally friendly but extremely expensive. This one, I believe, will fulfil exactly the same role at a much lower price.
Thank you. Councillor Glacken, I have a question.
Thank you. Just by way of clarification and follow-up from Councillor Thurley's question, while the more expensive option may have been more environmentally friendly, my understanding was that it would still necessitate leaving a layer on there, and while it would not take up a large amount of space, accumulatively it would continue to take up more and more space. So can I ask what proportion of space would have been taken up with the alternative option that left a small amount on there? Or is that, it may not have been calculated, and I appreciate that.
Mr. Ferris?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the amount of airspace consumed by the expensive option would be negligible. It's a very thin layer of just a hydro spray, if you like, so it would be very small, so would have very little impact on consumption.
Thank you.
Just a couple of questions from the chair, if I could, Mr. Ferris. The idea of having the cover every night is purely an EPA requirement. Is that correct? You're still on.
Yeah, so it is a requirement to prevent odours from being detected outside the site, and one of the mechanisms to do that is daily cover. And where most of our licence conditions are objective-based, outcome-based, there is a clause in all landfill contracts for daily cover. Most of them say daily, ours says weekly or whenever else directed or required.
Okay, thank you. Now, another question, and it relates to the fact that the motion here is for an item with the amount of $237,000, which is $90-odd thousand more than the cheapest quote. So obviously the work was done to to work out that the $95,000, there was much more, if you like, use without maintenance of the dearer one compared to the first one. Is that, and that's the equation that's been done by council staff?
Yes.
You're
So-
still on?
Yeah, so through you, Mr Chair. Certainly both products could do the task, albeit the preferred one is a lot more robust and heavy duty machine, and a lot more flexible around operations and adding extra liners to the system. So in weighing that up, the assessment panel believed the extra investment was well worth it for the advantages that the recommended system provides.
Yeah, I note that the weight of the system that's been recommended is about 3 tonne.
Versus 1, that's right.
1.6, I think the tonnage was. But what I'm concerned about is the potential of damage when we're moving this item into place. And obviously it requires some coordination. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so the assessment team visited both systems in use on other landfills, and it was really clear that one system was just a lot sturdier, and therefore the spool diameters and the engine covers and the general moving of the product was a lot more superior with the recommended model, and therefore the opportunity for it to be broken, damaged, out of action was significantly less.
Okay. Now, with regard to the more expensive option, obviously from my perspective on an ongoing environmental sustainability, the more expensive option would be more sustainable environmentally if you take into account the amount of energy used in building the option that we're going with. There was an asterisk alongside the price for the more expensive model, and I presume that that was for the annual cost. Did that include the cost of council staff? And was that part of the quotation, or has that been factored in by council on top of the original quote from that tenderer?
Through you, Mr Chair, the cost there is the cost submitted by the contractor. They will provide the 2 staff on a daily basis with the machinery and the product to spray over that. And yes, the asterisk is an ongoing fee, because obviously the product will need replenishing when stocks get low, and the staff will be required throughout, where the cover system is a one-off capital investment and minimal effort to roll that out and take it back up each morning.
Okay, so what, in your estimation, would it the annual charges, like the annual cost, increase to, so that we can do sort of compare apples to apples? What do you estimate the annual cost would be if you add the staff time in moving this recommended solution into position and away on a daily basis, and add that to that cost? What would that have made a difference to the the overall cost of this solution?
Through you, Mr Chair, I haven't got those figures in front of me, but certainly it wouldn't represent value compared to the price of the third option. The system that's recommended will significantly reduce the staff time that they currently invest in placing fill over it, so carting fill to the tipping side and then spreading that. So where that may be a 1 to 2 hour process per day to roll out and then take back the mats, will be a half an hour process. So
Right.
So it'll be a small amount of staff time compared to having 2 staff on site every day spraying 160 square metres or 1,600 square metres.
Okay, just one other thing, if I can. You obviously now have the solution on a one-off basis for, you've got an annual cost for this, but if we have other areas of the landfill that require a cover on a temporary basis, this would be definitely an option that you would consider in the future as a cost-effective option, providing that one-off solution?
Certainly, and that was one of the advantages of the recommended system, was that we can add spools to it. So if we have other areas within the landfill site that need cover regularly or ad hoc, where we do have an odour concern with perhaps a stockpile of material, we can use those there by just moving the machine and leaving the mats in place. They slide on, slide off.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's about it. Any further questions? I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. I don't have any other items. There's been no notice of urgent business given to me, so I declare the meeting closed at 6:40 p.m.
Yeah, they're allowed to, I assume. There's no one ever tried to.